It's important to us as Americans today because by all historical rights, we shouldn't be here. By all historical rights, the Civil War should have destroyed us as a nation. By all historical rights, the skeptics, the aristocrats, the despots should have rejoiced and should have watched the American democracy destroy itself.
Yet, nearly 150 years after the defining conflict in United States history, many stories of our Civil War remain untold. Gettysburg, Bull Run, and Antietam are familiar battles fought in the East. But hundreds of miles from the opposing capitals of Washington and Richmond, another series of campaigns were fought. These on the great expanse of lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. Lands then considered to be the West.
I think in our popular memory of the Civil War, we tend to focus a lot on the East, on some of the battles in the East. But in fact, one could easily argue that the Civil War was won in the West. It was where the Union Army managed to bisect the Confederacy, taking the Mississippi River. So if we want to understand the full impact of this war on the people, you have to understand what went on in the West.
It is a nation born of war. Emboldened by the idea that all men are created equal, American colonists unite to fight their British rulers. In a world dominated by kings and tyrants, the American Revolution gives birth to a noble experiment in democracy.
Shore these up, pack that down. Dig that dirt, tote that barge, lift that bale. Better, but not good enough.
Slavery is the ugly exception to the cries of liberty at the country's founding.
Move along now, move along. Break your backs or I'll break them for you. Heave it.
One way to understand the irony or the paradox of how this could be a nation built on freedom and yet keep people in unfreedom or in slavery is to realize that many of these white Americans didn't see that as any sort of conflict at all. In fact, in their mind, these revolutionary principles only applied to white people.
The idea that all men are created equal was not a jarring contradiction for slaveholders and for most Americans in the 18th as well as the 19th century. To our sensibilities today, it's something that almost impossible for us to imagine how people could reconcile or live with that. But they did, and they did so really with ease.
Many slaveholders regard their property as childlike.
Although we think of African Americans as human beings now, in the 18th century, there was scientific evidence that proved they were the missing link between animals and human beings.
By the 1800s, Americans could point to the research of French scientist Georges Cuvier, then considered one of the world's great minds in the field of zoology. Cuvier was fascinated with a woman from South Africa named Sarah Baartman. Known throughout England and France as the Hottentot Venus, the large woman is displayed in a traveling sideshow that describes her as a phenomenon of nature. Upon her death, Cuvier's autopsy report concludes that Bartman was a species closer to the great apes than humans.
And so when you have science that proves through evidence, through experimental research, that African people are in fact subhuman or at least inferior, it gives the contradiction of democracy and slavery some weight, because these people are not citizens. These people are not full human beings.
The first Africans landed on the shores of North America in 1619, a year before the arrival of the Pilgrims. By the time the Constitution was ratified in 1789, the new United States had a slave population of almost 700,000. Yet many, particularly Northern religious and political leaders, recognized the moral conflict between slavery and liberty. In 1808, Congress bans the importation of slaves.
At the time of the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, it was relatively easy for the founders to think that slavery was going to go away because slavery as an institution was declining. Well, then in the 1790s, the cotton gin was invented. And suddenly, from the institution declining, as it had been before, it began to increase.
The international slave trade is replaced with a thriving domestic slave trade. It becomes the lifeblood of the cotton economy.
The rise of cotton changes the face of the nation. It changes the conditions of life for Black people across the United States.
75% of the South's cotton is shipped abroad, most of it to England and France.
Cotton is the white gold of the transatlantic economy. Cotton was for the 19th century economy, for the Industrial Revolution, what oil is today for the world economy that we live in. Southerners needed to make the profits that they needed to make from that cotton, but how to do it? You need a cheap labor force. If you can enslave that labor force, then you're getting it at the cheapest rates possible.
By the time of the Civil War, the enslaved people providing that labor are valued at about $3 billion. That's more than the combined value of all the railroads, factories, and banks then in America. And yet, it is not only Southerners who benefit from the cotton windfalls. Northern banks have a stranglehold on many Southern planters. Cotton mills, shipping interests, even insurance companies in the North reap great profits from America's white gold.
The nation's economy was built on the back of slaves. This was not a Southern issue. It was a national issue. And it was an issue that was not a problem because the economy of slavery and the economy of wage labor in the North were compatible. They worked brilliantly together. The raw materials produced by the hands of slaves fueled not just the rural South, but it also helped energize a growing industrial North.
All right, boys, we got a fresh load of brick. As soon as you're done piling that brick up, we need to...
Let's tell a terrible truth, that most Northern whites, although they lived in what were legally, ostensibly, free states, were thoroughly committed to white racial supremacy. As any random sampling you might take of slaveholders in the Southern states where slavery was legal. Take a census of Black people in the North, free Black people in the North, and you will find that only in a handful of locations did they have anything even approaching civil equality. For Northern whites, slavery was a problem, not because it was an act of racial injustice, but because slavery had permitted Black people into North America. Northern whites wanted a nation that was, in effect, a sandbox for white people only. Northern states might be free states. They were also anti-black states.
A powerful minority called abolitionists preach of the evils of slavery. Most Northerners denounce the abolitionists as pariahs and extremists. But by the 1850s, the abolitionist message begins to resonate with many who begin to rally around the anti-slavery cause.
And so faced with that challenge, these Southern slaveholders begin to develop their own moral justification for slavery, beginning in the 1830s. And they start talking about slavery as a positive good, that slavery is something that is redeeming the people of African descent, and that we as Southern slaveholders are taking care of and civilizing these people. So it's a moral issue for them. It's an economic issue for them. And we also can't forget it's a social, racial issue for them. If you get rid of slavery, you get rid of the structure that is guaranteeing all white people in Southern society status.
And yet the catalyst for civil war comes not from North or South, but rather West.
The United States is expanding, and so there's a need for more land, for more cotton, and also for more slaves.
By 1850, a nation of 13 original colonies has grown to 31 states. America stretches westward, not only to the Mississippi River, but all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
A newspaper editor actually coined the term, and he said it was the manifest destiny of the United States to overspread the continent, to spread liberty. But wait a minute, what about slavery? Is slavery going to spread? We spread liberty? Are we going to spread slavery too? Does slavery follow the flag?
Southern politicians demand to not only preserve slavery, but to expand it. Political compromises in 1820, 1850, and then again in 1854 provide temporary solutions. But in the end, Western expansion disrupts the balance in Congress between free and slave states. A prelude of the bloodletting to come erupts in Kansas Territory, where voters battle over whether their new state will be free or slave.
Suddenly, in 1860, a candidate is elected to the presidency who is unashamedly, unapologetically opposed to slavery. And when Southerners hear this, they hear the death knell ringing for them.
Abraham Lincoln from Illinois is the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party. He is elected without receiving a single electoral vote from the South. Lincoln's priority is to preserve the Union. The president-elect vows to not interfere with slavery in states where it already exists. That does little to comfort those in the South who fear Lincoln will use the federal government to trample states' rights.
For white Southerners, with Lincoln's election, they saw the beginning of the end. They believed that a Republican Party committed to stopping the expansion of slavery in the territories would spell their demise. They saw Lincoln as a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Lincoln is an arrow pointed at the heart of their entire social and economic system.
Come on now, nice and tight. Yeah, I got it. All right, that's good, that's good.
Well, there were about 3.9 million enslaved people in the U.S. in 1860, and that ended up being about 40% of the Confederate population. So that's a significant proportion.
Boss, I'm thirsty. I want some water.
I'm gonna tell you something right now. You remember what happened to the last one of y'all that got up here running your mouth at me? Do you remember that?
Now, if you break the Confederacy down by region, you can see that it's in the Deep South where you see the greatest percentage of that slave population.
Now you stop right there. I told you, you was last.
And so it's not really a coincidence that you see those deep southern states are the first to secede.
Yeah, you go ahead and you take your drink this time. That's what I'd expect out of you, boy, just wasting the water. That'll be the last water you get today.
Just 2 months after Lincoln's election, Mississippi, the largest cotton-producing state, joins South Carolina and secedes from the Union. Within a month, 5 more states from the Deep South follow. Jefferson Davis, who recently resigned his U.S. Senate seat, is chosen president of the new Confederate States of America. Davis agrees with the official declaration made by the Mississippi secession delegates, who defend secession by stating,
"Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of the commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition, or a dissolution of the Union whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin."
One of the most poignant lines says, "We are thoroughly interested in maintaining the institution of slavery because it's one of the greatest benefits of mankind." And so that's an important acknowledgement of how vital slavery was, not just to the state, but also to that region, that they made no bones about it. Slavery was the central issue of the Civil War.
The belief that liberty should be extended to all people, regardless of class, color, or gender, that simply was not within the thinking of most antebellum Americans. And for slaveholders, they believed that liberty and freedom was actually dependent upon the enslavement of African Americans. So for white Southerners on the eve of the Civil War, they could make the bold claim that they were fighting for their liberty and feel no remorse, feel no tension, feel no contradiction in the fact that they thought that that liberty was dependent upon fighting and dying for the enslavement of African Americans.
If we're talking about politics, the political tensions that erupted, sectional tensions and whatnot, are rooted in slavery. The economic differences were rooted in slavery. And the states' right argument, well, we're talking about a state's right to do what? The southern states seceded to protect slavery.
85 years after declaring itself independent from Great Britain, America's grand experiment in democracy is about to be put to its greatest test. April 12, 1861. Charleston, South Carolina. Carrying out instructions from Jefferson Davis, Confederate forces bombard Fort Sumter, forcing the surrender of the Union garrison the next day. President Lincoln responds by calling for 75,000 troops. That order convinces Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to join the Confederacy. Lincoln refuses to recognize the Confederate government and instead considers the seceding states to be in rebellion. As an Illinois congressman, Lincoln had said, "A house divided cannot stand." Now, as president, Lincoln must use force to unite a divided nation or watch the United States be dissolved.
There was the belief by many that there would not be a war, and that certainly if there was going to be any sort of bloodshed, it would not be very extended. One or two engagements and both sides would come to their senses.
Both sides believed the war would be over within 90 days. There would be little bloodshed. One politician stated that the amount of bloodshed could be mopped up with a handkerchief.
So when the war begins, you have men who are fighting for preservation of the Union, and you have men who are fighting for their homes, defending it from what they perceive as an invasion. But they had no idea. They thought that it was going to be an adventure. We'll be home by Christmas.
Old brown Rosie, the rose of Alabama, the sweet tobacco posy is my rose of Alabama.
And what they found out is they ended up in camps, dying of disease, incredible boredom, loneliness, hot, cold, punctuated by these incredible conflicts.
The Union hopes to bring a quick end to the war by attacking a Confederate force near a crossroad in Virginia called Manassas Junction. Instead, Federal troops, led by Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, are routed. The Union force scurries back to Washington, only 30 miles to the north. The Battle of Bull Run is the first major battle in the East. But Union leaders realize that the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy means taking the fight beyond the Appalachians.
We underestimate the importance of the Western theater at our peril, because in the West, you have the single most important economic highway of the North American continent, and that is the Great Mississippi Valley. If you wanted to put a finger on the most important commercial confluence, the most important economic lifeline of the American Republic, then it flowed through the West.
In Virginia, the east-west flowing rivers are obstacles, but in the West, they are avenues. One Union general writes, "Whatever nation gets control of the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers will control the continent." In February 1862, 15,000 Union soldiers land along the banks of the Tennessee River. It is an invasion to end a rebellion. The 652-mile Tennessee runs parallel to the Mississippi further to the west. It cuts through the heart of the Western Confederacy, from the Ohio River, through the crucial border state of Kentucky, and into the state of Tennessee. For nearly 200 miles, it even flows through northern Alabama. Like the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, the Tennessee is wide enough for transport steamers to quickly deliver troops and supplies. For the Union, this campaign will be a test for the Navy's ironclad gunboats, state-of-the-art warships. The coming battle will also be a test for a little-known graduate of West Point, a soldier with an average record whom many have unfairly branded a drunk. General Ulysses S. Grant is the unlikeliest of heroes, yet he will emerge from the West as the greatest soldier and general in the entire Union Army. Grant's orders: seize 2 strategic forts guarding the Confederate interior. Fort Henry overlooks the Tennessee River. 12 miles east, Fort Donelson guards the Cumberland, a river leading to the Tennessee capital of Nashville.
Those forts are important because It was hoped by the Confederates that they would stop Union gunboats, Union riverboats carrying troops and supplies, from penetrating farther up the Tennessee River and up the Cumberland River.
On February 6th, naval gunboats pound Fort Henry into submission. But the Confederate defensive position at Fort Donelson is much stronger. 2 river batteries containing more than a dozen heavy guns point northward toward a sharp bend of the Cumberland. On February 14th, Union ironclads fire hundreds of Iron Valentines into Fort Donelson. But this time, the Navy is decisively repulsed. Meanwhile, Grant's force of 27,000 moves overland and approaches the landward side of Fort Donelson.
Grant later summed up his idea of the art of war in a rather pithy way. He said, get at the enemy as quick as you can, hit him as hard as you can, and keep moving on.
The next morning, Grant's art of war philosophy is put to a serious test. Confederates inside Fort Donelson attempt to break out and bust through Grant's lines. After furious fighting in the ravines and steep terrain surrounding the fort, Grant forces the Confederates back inside Fort Donelson. Confederate Brigadier General Simon Buckner asks for terms of surrender. Grant's response, unconditional and immediate.
I think what this unconditional surrender demand tells us about Grant is his determination. We've got a general here who's not going to fool around, who's going to prosecute this war and is going to end it in a way that it ought to be ended.
At Fort Donelson, 12,000 Confederates surrender, and the Northern press anoints a national hero.
But Grant, with his initials, U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant, it came together brilliantly. Ulysses S. Grant's victories, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, they captivated a Northern nation craving good news, especially in the wake of what had happened at First Manassas.
Just 9 days after the Confederate surrender, Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, falls to Union troops. More importantly, the victory enables Union forces to seize control of the lower Tennessee River, the strategic pathway leading into the Confederate heartland. Confederate forces in the West respond by abandoning Kentucky and Middle Tennessee, retreating south into West Tennessee, northern Alabama, and Mississippi.
You have to wonder how soon Confederates in deep South states like Mississippi and Alabama thought that they would have Union troops on their soil.
March 1862. The Federals lease a fleet of steamboats to transport Grant's troops deeper into Tennessee. Over 12 dozen steam southward, equipped with everything an army needs to mount a major campaign. A journey requiring weeks overland now takes only days on the Tennessee. The Union forces unload at Pittsburgh Landing, where roads provide easy access to rail lines crucial to the Confederate war effort. By early April 1862, Grant's force of 48,000 stretches across a high wooded plateau in southwest Tennessee. Grant's most inexperienced troops camp over 2 miles from Pittsburgh Landing, near a simple Methodist meeting house named Shiloh. Roughly translated, the Hebrew word Shiloh means a place of peace. Grant's mission: sever 2 vital Western Confederate railroads which intersect at the small town of Corinth, Mississippi.
A lot of the Federal High Command will talk about how we have to go down to Corinth. C.F. Smith talks about we have to root them out like you would a badger out of a hole.
Running through Corinth is the South's only complete rail connection linking the Mississippi to the Atlantic.
One Confederate official called it the vertebrae of the Confederacy. So that's what makes Shiloh, I think, so important. And if you're a Confederate, you know that if the Union captures Corinth and captures control of those railroads, your supply situation is difficult, your movement of troops is difficult, your railroad system, which isn't very good anyway, is going to be even worse.
Grant knows a large enemy force has gathered to defend the Corinth Railroad junction, but he is unaware those same Confederates are now marching forward to attack him. General Albert Sidney Johnston commands the Western Confederate Army. President Jefferson Davis boasts, "If Johnston is not a general, then we have no general." For Johnston, it is a race against the clock. He has received intelligence that more Union troops will soon be joining Grant at Pittsburgh Landing. Marching overland from Nashville to Shiloh is a second Union Army. 35,000 soldiers under the command of General Don Carlos Buell.
The opportunity that is presented to Johnston, of course, is to hit one at a time. And this is not rocket science. You don't need a military academy education to figure out that you want to fight one army instead of two.
Johnston has a bold plan to destroy Grant's army before Buell's forces arrive. Surprise and turn Grant's left flank. Cut off his line of retreat to the Tennessee River. Pin his army against the swampy lowlands of Owl Creek. Force Grant to surrender. The Confederate advance toward Shiloh is troubled from the start. A spring storm turns crude roads into rivers of mud. A march which should have taken a single day to accomplish consumes 3. In the coming battle, this delay will haunt Johnston and his Confederate army. U.S. Grant is under explicit orders from the Union command. Do not advance until Buell and his army arrive. Grant is convinced Johnston lacks the resolve and ability to attack.
If Grant has a weakness at this time in the war, it's that he doesn't always consider what his opposition will do. Johnston wouldn't be stupid enough to leave those entrenchments at Corinth and march 20 miles and attack us in the open. Never happened, never happened.
16-year-old Thomas Duncan from Mississippi is a courier for the Confederates.
Riding out to a high point in front of our center, I hear the Union troops drilling in their encampment. The drum and fife and the commands of the officers are plainly heard. It suddenly struck me. The Union Army is absolutely unaware of the presence of our army.
Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman receives reports of large groups of Confederates, but he dismisses them as mere scouting parties.
What the hell is this garbage? You people are standing.
The preceding year, Sherman had gotten in trouble for overestimating the number of Confederates he was facing. The newspapers had even reported that he was insane. So in the days leading up to Shiloh, Sherman was very determined that he was not going to have that happen again.
Just a mile beyond Sherman's camp is the leading edge of Johnston's 43,000 Confederates.
and they camp there. And some of them are even firing their weapons, testing them. And yet nobody pays that much attention to it.
And he said unto them, When ye pray, say, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as in heaven, so on earth. Give us day by day.
Most of the Confederates are like Thomas Duncan, raw recruits who have never tasted battle.
As night came on, we lay down in line of battle to rest and slumber, realizing the danger of the coming morn and the certainty that for many, the next sunrise would be their last on earth.
Colonel Everett Peabody commands a brigade on the Union front line. Unlike his superiors, Peabody believes the Confederate presence is more than scouting parties. Despite orders not to engage the enemy, Peabody orders 250 men out on a pre-dawn patrol. Just after 5 a.m., they step onto the farm of James Fraley, some 2 miles southwest of Shiloh Church. They are the opening shots of what will become the first epic battle of the Civil War. After an hour, Peabody's troops withdraw from Fraley Field.
It wasn't really until about sunrise that it really became clear on the Union side that they were up against Johnston's whole army.
Johnston realizes that he has the opportunity to alter the course of the war. He says to his men, "Today we must conquer or perish."
And there had been warning signs for days that the Confederates were not just up to something, there was something big in the works. And when it exploded, I mean, just all hell breaks loose. And the Confederate attack is really like a sledgehammer.
Colonel Peabody's superior is General Benjamin Prentiss.
Colonel Peabody, report! Sir, all indications are that there's a sizable force of Confederates that are coming up from Orient.
Prentiss accuses the young colonel of violating orders and bringing on the engagement.
I didn't bring on an engagement. The whole Confederate army's marching on me, sir.
Prentiss was furious. This had been contrary to orders, and Peabody had not gotten permission. And Prentiss confronted Peabody and scolded him very severely for bringing on a fight.
Prentiss's heavily outnumbered division puts up stubborn resistance, but by 9 a.m., their defense crumbles. Killed while trying to rally his troops is Colonel Everett Peabody. In 4 hours of fighting at Shiloh, the Union suffers over 2,000 casualties. Half of Grant's soldiers at Shiloh have never been in combat.
There's that first time you get shot at. And there's that first time you realize that this is for real. and that you could die. You're seeing what artillery fire does to the human body. You're seeing blood spilled in ways that you can't imagine. Those moments that really haunt men for the rest of their lives. This is some of the experience in the woods around the Shiloh church that morning, is they're experiencing all the horrors of combat for the first time. And you're seeing things that really violate all sense of decency.
"18-year-old Leander Stillwell is a private with the 61st Illinois.
I was astonished at our first retreat in the morning. It seemed to me we were forever disgraced. I kept thinking to myself, what will they say about this at home?
Instead of advancing, many of the Confederates break ranks to ransack Union camps. Some have not eaten since leaving Corinth, Mississippi 3 days earlier. For many of the raw recruits, the spoils of war are too tempting to pass up. Johnston is infuriated when he catches an officer plundering. To rally his men, Johnston takes his own plunder, a simple tin cup.
Let this be my portion of the spoils today.
By mid-morning, the Confederate advance reaches Shiloh Church. It is the scene of some of the most savage fighting for battle.
Horses are screeching, horses are dying, people are getting hit, they're screaming. They're calling for their mothers, they're calling on God. It's just mass confusion.
Most soldiers engaged at Shiloh are between 18 and 30 years old.
At a battle like Shiloh, they realize it's not all about adventure, it's not all about lofty concepts like honor and independence. They realize it's about killing. And for many of them, this is an uncomfortable, to say the least, realization. They don't easily transition into becoming killing machines. They have a great deal of ambivalence about shouldering these weapons and actually killing people.
16-year-old musician John Cockerell arrived with his father, the commander of the 70th Ohio Infantry. John and his father become separated near Shiloh Church. Young Cockerell soon finds himself aiding the wounded.
Near Shiloh Church, passing soldiers called for me to assist them. We carried the poor fellow to the rear and found there a scene of disorder. Not to say, panic. The enemy began pressing closely, and Shiloh Church was no more a desirable place for my military observations. I started towards the Tennessee River. I had not proceeded more than a mile when I encountered General John MacArthur's Highland Brigade of Illinois troops. A chipper young lieutenant stopped me and asked where did I belong. I replied that I belonged to Ohio. He said that Ohio was making a bad show of it, then asked if I wanted to fight with them. I responded I was willing to take a temporary berth in his regiment. Thus, I became attached to Company B of the 9th Illinois Regiment.
John Cockerell doesn't realize it, but he has joined a unit that will have the highest casualty rate of all Union regiments at Shiloh. In 5 hours of brutal fighting, the Confederates managed to overrun the forward Union camps. Fresh Union divisions moved forward from Pittsburgh Landing to to help stop the onslaught. Johnston personally supervises the Confederate right, while General P.G.T. Beauregard oversees the left. By 11 a.m., the battle rages along a crooked 3-mile front. U.S. Grant has completely underestimated the Confederates. It is a mistake he will never make again. At noon, Grant orders Sherman to counterattack.
You begin to see the Confederate attack start to splinter. They're not able to deal that final lethal blow. And the Confederate attack is beginning to lose a lot of its steam.
After some of the most severe fighting at Shiloh, Sherman grudgingly gives ground. But their decimated divisions have bought Grant what he needs most: precious time. Adding to the Confederates' woe at Shiloh is the hellish terrain itself. A morass of dense woods, thick undergrowth, and deep ravines through which they must advance. Most serious is the awful carnage. Earlier in the day at Ray Field, the 6th Mississippi marched straight into a murderous Union crossfire. In mere moments, 300 of the regiment's 425 soldiers were cut down. The slaughter of the 6th Mississippi is one of many such scenes repeated again and again at Shiloh.
I think that the reason for the extremely high casualty lists at Shiloh was simply that you had two sides that were very similar in the motivation, and they were simply very determined to prevail and not to be beaten. I think if they had been using short swords, they probably would have stood up against each other and hacked at each other until they had killed about that many of each other.
Though staggered, the majority of Johnston's army continues to engage the Union left and right. Meanwhile, another fight erupts, this one in an oak thicket choking the center of the battlefield. Since mid-morning, Union soldiers have been putting up a stubborn defense in the thick underbrush.
And the Confederate soldiers, hearing the Union bullets whistling through the thicket, referred to the area as the Hornet's Nest.
Over the course of 4 hours, Confederate troops repeatedly stormed the Hornet's Nest. Each time, they are driven back. Colonel Randall Lee Gibson commands a brigade from Louisiana and Arkansas.
4 times the assault proved unavailing. The strong and almost inaccessible position of the enemy, his infantry well covered in ambush, and his artillery skillfully posted and efficiently served, was found to be impregnable to infantry alone. We were repulsed.
It's one of those situations where the geography plays a role. The Hornet's Nest is a very difficult place to get to. So it does come down to geography and just sheer determination.
Johnston is determined to crush the Federal stronghold. The Confederate commander will personally rally a group who has refused to charge.
The Yankees were stubborn, he said, and you're going to have to give them the bayonet. Johnston leaned out and tapped their bayonets with his tin cup.
We're going to have to use the bayonet.
As he got to the middle of their line, He turned his horse toward the enemy and he said, "I will lead you."
They are advanced by Johnston into a peach orchard just east of the Hornet's Nest. At the peach orchard is some of the most bitter fighting of Shiloh. Private Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee.
I had heard and read of battlefields, seen pictures of battlefield. Horses and men, cannon and wagons all jumbled together while the ground was strewn with dead and dying and wounded, but I must confess that I never realized the pomp and circumstance of the thing called glorious war till I saw this. It all seemed to me a dream.
With the battle raging around the peach orchard, an aide to General Johnston finds the Confederate commander reeling in his saddle.
He said, "General, are you wounded?" Johnston said, "Yes, and I fear seriously." The subordinate led Johnston into a place that was sheltered and helped him off his horse.
General, sir, please respond to us.
He began looking for the wound. He couldn't find it.
I don't see anything else, Captain, myself.
He was poking around in Johnston's clothes. Where's the wound? He couldn't find it.
We don't know what's wrong with him.
Johnston had quickly lost consciousness completely.
Do you know me? Johnston! Johnston! Johnston!
Behind Johnston's knee, a bullet has lacerated a large artery. In less than 20 minutes, he bleeds to death. General Albert Sidney Johnston will be the highest-ranked officer killed in the Civil War. The day that began with so much promise ends with the death of the man Jefferson Davis, considered to be the finest officer in the Confederacy. Word of Johnston's death slowly makes its way through the Confederate ranks at Shiloh. A soldier from Louisiana remarks, "A chilliness of gloom crept over our entire command."